Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky is a book that some people hate, some people love, and some people fear. It presents itself as a manual with guidance you can follow in the pursuit of political change. I think it's in precisely that sense that we have to say the book is a failure. I'm going to read you a couple of excerpts, examples as to why my views differ fundamentally from the book, even on the level of pragmatic action, but also on the level, I suppose, of philosophy or analysis or what have you. I'm going to talk a little bit about the context surrounding this video being made in the last few days of 2016, December 2016, as to why this book is so controversial, so much discussed now. And I'm calling this video part one because much, much more could be said about this book. And I think much more could be said in criticizing the unexamined assumptions of left-wing radicalism that have crept into ecology, that have crept into veganism, that have crept into some of the political struggles of our times, unquestioned and unexamined. Most of this advice for us now is bad advice, is terrible advice. But I think there's a romantic memory of the 1960s, which is very much the era this book hails from, by the way. There's a romantic echo of what 1960s radicalism was that many people still aspire to emulate. So I think they look back on a book like this, frankly, with rose-colored glasses. They're wanting to ignore what's wrong with it. All right, quote, page 100. The job of the organizer is to maneuver and bait the establishment so that it will publicly attack him as a dangerous enemy. The word enemy is sufficient to put the organizer on the side of the people, to identify him with the have-nots, but it is not enough to endow him with the special qualities that induce fear, and thus give him the means to establish his own power against the establishment. Here again, we find that it is power and fear that are essential to the development of faith. So he means the faith of the followers in the organizer. Close quote. Do you think that's how gay rights became one of the most successful political movements of the 20th century and one of the most successful of the 21st century? Gay rights in many countries around the world, but for example in Canada, has been astoundingly successful. There were laws they wanted abolished, and they won. They abolished them. There were new laws they wanted passed. For example, gay marriage, and they passed them. Okay? Gay rights is now so successful in a country like Canada that it is no longer a protest-driven movement. It's no longer organizing to oppose the establishment. They can basically celebrate because they've won those victories. Do you think that gay rights, let's say back in the 1960s, do you think that their strategy was for homosexuals to try to be regarded as a dangerous enemy by the establishment? Do you think that gay rights leaders wanted to be regarded as a dangerous enemy by the establishment? Do you think that's how they made progress? Do you think that they wanted to be regarded with fear by the establishment, that they wanted more homophobia, that they wanted to be more dehumanized, whether as leaders, leaders of the movement or the community? I think the exact opposite of what he says here could be argued much more persuasively on a solid foundation of empirical examples and with real-world implications for how we organize activism or political dissent, pursuit of political change today. I think the exact opposite of what he has said here. And to spell it out, I think that homosexuals did not want to be feared. They wanted to be regarded as normal human beings. They had to fight against a real phobia, a real fear of them, a dehumanizing tendency, right? I can say the same about the black civil rights movement. I think African Americans were not pursuing so a few did. I shouldn't generalize. I think the successful long-term elements that helped African Americans improve the situation in the United States was not trying to get this edgy reputation as being a dangerous enemy of the establishment. I think on the contrary, it was earning a higher level of respect from the establishment. Not a higher level of fear from the establishment, but a higher level of trust. Yeah? If people are too afraid of you to interview you on the nightly news, what does that get you? And there are some leaders that that's what you want to pursue. So, I mean, whether we apply this to what tactics were actually successful in the 1960s or what tactics would be actually successful today, I think many of you would read a passage like this without any alarm bells going off. But for me, this is 180 degrees wrong. This also brings me to another issue. I guess I'll jump ahead now. I'll digress. There is another video on YouTube by a very well-known commentator on politics, Sargon of Akkad. And in his review of this book, which is really just praise for the book, I don't even fault him for that. He wanted to counter a sort of hysterical tendency to demonize this book. He felt he wanted to give it a fair airing. And he does a video that's nothing but praise, which gives you a kind of survey of the highlights of the book. He claims that this book never endorses violence, it never says we should resort to violence, and never even indirectly suggests that, never alludes to it. And on the contrary, I think that Sargon simply does not have enough of a background in politics and political science to understand that this book does repeatedly allude to and endorse violence. Even if it is indirectly, it is not that indirect. Now, a passage like this, Inducing Fear from the Establishment, okay, so you can say this is nonviolent. There is one passage in this book that uses the pretty obvious metaphor of killing rats. The actual wording is that he faults other organizers. Alinsky faults weaker, lesser organizers for only getting rid of four-legged rats. Whereas he, Alinsky, and people like him, Alinsky and the students he's trained, they move on to getting rid of two-legged rats. That passage, I don't know how you can read it without thinking that this is about killing people. Getting rid of a rat in modern English. These people aren't vegans. They're not going to trap the rat and non-violently release it in the wild or something. It's completely clear, I think, that that's talking about violence against people, two-legged rats. There's another passage that sticks in my mind because I've recently studied the history of Russia under Lenin and so on, where he endorses and praises Lenin's pragmatic view that democracy only matters when it's convenient for you, and then as soon as you take over the guns, as soon as you take over the means of violence, whether that's the army or just your revolution, your rebel group gets armed, then suddenly democracy doesn't matter anymore. Now, that passage, it does not explicitly say violence is good, but that's not too indirect. It's really not. I think someone like Sargon reads that and he doesn't know the history that's being alluded to. The reality is that what Lenin did was both dishonorable and immoral in holding elections when he lost the elections, because he did lose. The Bolshevik Party lost. Lenin should not have been the leader of Russia under the elections. And who won? A rival left-wing party. The left-wing party that won was called the Socialist Revolutionary Party. They're also pretty far on the left, but not as extreme as the Bolshevik Party, right? So Lenin should have handed over power to the leader of the Socialist Revolutionaries because they won the elections. And the Bolsheviks should have become a minority party in their House of Parliament. He didn't do that. Lenin shut down the House of Parliament and hunted down and persecuted and executed, hunted down and killed the members of those other parties and even the supporters. Thousands and thousands of people. Sorry, obviously it adds up to millions. The violence Lenin was engaged in, not Stalin, Lenin. Many people want to imagine that Lenin represents the good old days before things got too violent. Unbelievably, sickeningly, I mean, door-to-door house searches is persecution of the worst kind. Very few people today seem to, well, I guess this is the 100th anniversary, right? 1917, 2017. Very, very few people read the history of what happened 100 years ago in that first period of communism. But it's incredibly brutal. And this book is endorsing violence in alluding to it in that passage. So these are two examples. So I just say on that specific issue, Sargon is wrong. Sargon claims that the book does endorse violence, nor does it indirectly endorse violence. I think that in a passage like this, you are indirectly alluding to the use of force. And I think in the other passages I mentioned, such as talking about getting rid of two-legged rats, talking about Lenin, talking about discarding democracy as soon as you have access to guns, as Lenin did, that's pretty directly endorsing violence. And you have to be pretty ignorant of political science not to get it when you read that. Now, however, I mean, those might be more salacious or controversial passages. It's not why I personally fault or disagree with this book. If this book had useful advice despite its failings, I would say so. I don't think this book has useful advice. I think that on the contrary, this is based on an illusion that back in 1960 had some reality to it. An illusion that all that radicals have to do, all that critics of the establishment have to do, is turn the tap on the seething discontent of the masses, that the masses are just going to rise up to support you, as soon as you reach out to them. Now, certainly in the 1960s, specifically with African Americans in the United States, I know why he would feel that way. I mean, it must have felt to him that all he had to do was go out to these ghettos and reach out to people and positively, one of his examples, he gives many, is go into these ghettos and talk to people about how bad their housing conditions are, and then try to organize them to protest against their landlord. And you seem to be able to harness this tremendous discontent in, poor black neighborhoods of Chicago or one of his Rochester, I believe it's Rochester, New York. But, there were these slums and slum lords, landlords in the slums, and there were these kinds of very clear social struggles where all the organizer had to do apparently was show up and talk to people, and you could start, harnessing seething discontent. Well, the vast majority of political struggles are not like that, okay? Gay rights was not like that. It was not the case that organizers should go around and talk to people. And it leaves, but even though gay people definitely were dissatisfied with some laws and with forms of prejudice against them, they had something to struggle for. It was a real struggle. And they were, dissatisfied with, religious attitudes towards them and so on. Many, many social struggles, they can't just harness seething discontent. Instead, they're addressed to a public which is largely apathetic, largely indifferent to the issue, and satisfied. If you want people to stop using coal power and switch to using solar power, everyone's happy with their electricity. Can you even tell? If you travel from city to city in America, in Canada, in Australia, okay, let's use Australia as the example. Australia has one of the worst coal power plants in the world. It's a famous reactor. It's a famous power plant burning coal in Australia, and it's on the list. When you get the top 10 list of the worst polluting power plants in the world, it's normally somewhere in the top 5, one of the worst. If you drive a car from city to city in Australia, can you tell when you're in a city that has coal-based electricity as opposed to another form of electricity generation? You can't tell. And the people are just as happy. The radio works the same. The air conditioning works the same. The internet works the same. People can be contented and indifferent to the form of social change you're trying to pursue. So if your goal is a strictly ecological goal, you want to motivate people to be concerned about the burning of coal in Australia, this book, the whole approach, is going to be useless to you. It's just not the case that you can walk into a neighborhood this way and organize people and have seething discontent uprising. There is no seething discontent. People are maybe mildly curious or interested when you explain to them, look, in our city, we use this coal power plant. The next city over, they maybe are using a slightly better form of electricity generation. We need to talk about this. We need to talk about how government policy can change. The idea that he says, okay, I'll read another little sample here. Quote, establishing one's credentials of competency is only part of the organizer's first job. He needs other credentials to begin, credentials that enable him to meet the question, who asked you to come in here, with the answer you did. He must be invited in by a significant sector of the local population, their churches, street organizations, social clubs, or other groups. Okay, close quote. Now, okay, I understand the scenario this is written for in the 1960s, but do you think anyone today can operate that way? Do you think that a gay rights activist can even wait for that kind of invitation? Do you think that a vegan activist, an animal rights activist, can wait for that kind of invitation? That there are pre-existing civil society organizations that would invite someone in, that you're not going to go to them and educate them and instigate and say to them, hey, look, here's something you've never thought about before. Whales are really mistreated in theme parks. Whales are really being mistreated in SeaWorld. There's no seething discontent in the public. It's not like the masses are rising up. It's not like you can say, I'm going to wait until I'm invited in by the local church groups or labor unions or what have you. It's ridiculous. It's just not applicable. And one question I have not seen addressed anywhere in the book, maybe it's in here and I haven't found it yet. I've read this on the airplane and at the airport. I really do wonder if I missed it. But nowhere, I was really looking for it, nowhere could I see an honest discussion of the finances of organizing. Right? Maybe I should leave that for a separate video to talk about. Who do you think is paying the organizer to do this? So again, union organizers, civil rights, who is paying your bills? The reality is in the 1960s, we now know it was debated for a long time. We do know that left-wing organizers of this were paid by the Soviet Union, were paid by Moscow. And it used to be there was debate about it before the Moscow archives opened. So after 1989, for some years, scholars had independent access to the archives for the Soviet Union, and they confirmed actually many things that people suspected were true in the Soviet era. They were able to confirm really were true. So yes, in order to create more social contradictions in the United States, the Soviet Union actually did pay organizers to rile up black discontent in the United States. Now, whether or not that had good outcomes or bad outcomes is another question. But actually, the Soviet Union did pour money into funding this type of activity. Nobody is going to pay you to operate this way in 2016. And this whole concept of the professional organizer having a career and a dedicated education and an income from this kind of organizing, I feel that this is describing a world that is over. And it is a world that was based on the unique circumstances, really primarily of the Cold War, really primarily of communism and anti-communism, including money coming from the communist side. And to some extent, unique challenges like the experience of African Americans in the 1960s. I can read a passage on that. The education of an organizer requires frequent large conferences on organizational problems, analysis of power patterns, communication, conflict tactics, the education and development of community leaders, and the methods of introduction of new issues. For an organizer, time is meaningless. Meetings and caucuses drag endlessly into the early morning hours. The marriage record of organizers is, with rare exceptions, disastrous. Close quote. This is describing a whole world of devoted professionals with an education and a career just in organizing, like Saul Alinsky himself had for several decades. That world's over. What do you think? Who is going to pay me to go and get a master's degree in this, or attend conferences, or live this life? Nobody. Now, the other thing that's great is that the cost of organizing has dropped dramatically. We can have a conference on Google Hangouts tomorrow, no problem, or via Skype, or, these internet-based methods. It's wonderful that now for almost nothing, people can have a conference or a meeting. But what he is describing, which is genuinely people like himself getting on an airplane, eating in a restaurant, staying in a hotel, attending conferences that go on for days and days, and smoking cigarettes the whole time. That world is over. Anyone who is proposing a methodology of the pursuit of political change that relies on this professional class of organizers is giving terrible advice for the 21st century. And this whole book is built on that premise. So the whole book, even if it was only for that reason, you could say it's terrible advice. Okay, I'm now going to read you a short passage that is maybe the least controversial thing in the whole book, and many of you would read this without thinking twice about it. For me, I think it shows how far my views are and my pragmatic approach to organizing political dissent is from Saul Alinsky's. So, quote, "Not only does a single-issue organization condemn you to having a small organization, it is axiomatic that a single-issue organization won't last." Close quote. So I think that's false, and I think Saul Alinsky is lying to you when it really counts. Empirically speaking, do single-issue organizations achieve results? Do single-issue organizations last? Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Single-issue organization. Arguably, Mothers Against Drunk Driving is the single most successful civil society organization in the United States of America. Amazingly durable, amazingly effective. They've achieved their goals. They have a budget. They keep getting donations. They do public education in all the schools. Has there ever been a communist party in the United States of America as successful as Mothers Against Drunk Driving? Because, Saul Alinsky, he is a communist, even though he's a small c communist. He's a critic of communist orthodoxy, but he still is a communist. What empirical basis is there for claiming that single-issue organizations are small and not durable or ineffective? This is a huge question within veganism, animal rights, and ecology right now in 2016, is the moral, supposedly moral opposition to single-issue causes. So let's stick with Mothers Against Drunk Driving for a minute. Do you think Mothers Against Drunk Driving would be more successful if instead of being a single-issue cause, a single-issue organization, as I said here, if they didn't just talk about drunk driving, they also talked about feminism, and they also opposed abortion, and they also talked about, I don't know, what other issues. Let's say they didn't just oppose drunk driving. Let's say they also wanted to eliminate people drinking alcohol. They wanted higher taxes on alcohol for everyone, not just drunk drivers. We could throw in a bunch of other issues here. Let's say they're involved with labor unions. There's a particular labor union they support or something. They're involved. Let's say the bus drivers, labor unions. They're involved in labor. The more issues you throw in, so it stops being a single issue cause. For one thing, you're alienating more and more donors. Who wants to donate money to Mothers Against Drunk Driving now that they're involved with feminism and they're opposed to abortion and maybe they have religious views? Maybe they're involved with 5 or 10 different causes now. So fewer and fewer people are donating to them because fewer and fewer people can support ethically what this organization is in pursuit of. Furthermore, you're having more and more internal division within the organization. I mean, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, I assume some of their members are left-wing and some of them are right-wing. Probably a lot of their members are feminists, but some of them are not. Probably some of them are conservative women who oppose drunk driving and also don't much like feminism, right? So if you have a background in political science, you can see a lot of things that are wrong with this, but it ain't rocket science. It's not hard to see why this is terrible advice. On the contrary, one of the reasons why Mothers Against Drunk Driving is so effective, so successful, and so durable is that it is a single-issue organization. So is Saul Alinsky interested in empirical reality or not? The book tells you openly that it's trying to manipulate you, that it lies to you. There's an interesting part of the book. He talks about manipulation and lying. He talks about lying to your followers and why lying and manipulation are part of political organization, which is interesting to hear. I think this is an example of him lying where it really counts and not being honest about the fact that actually the more issues you bring in, the more you alienate people outside of the organization and the more conflict you create within the organization. As I say, this is not a compendious video. I could very easily do a sequel or a number of sequels talking about more issues that are raised in the book, whether specifically related to veganism and animal rights or more generally. I think I should say briefly that I'm recording this in the last few days of 2016 after the election of Donald Trump, during the election this year, 2016, there was intense interest in this book, a lot of it kind of hysterical interest, kind of exaggerating the evils of this book, because this book was linked very strongly to the life and beliefs and career of Hillary Clinton. So Hillary Clinton, as a young woman, was a big proponent of this book, a big fan of the author, and so on. And I think some people wanted to use this to try to attack Hillary Clinton as secretly being more of a radical than she really is, because the word radical is in the title. And some people maybe wanted to criticize Hillary Clinton to show how far she had drifted away from her roots in radicalism. Okay. And I do sympathize. I think the reason why Sargon of Akkad made this video, linked below this one, just giving a one-sided praise of this book, is because I think he wanted to counteract the hysteria, which is basically linked to Hillary Clinton, that was demonizing this book out of all proportion to its merits or its faults or what have you. I think it's important to criticize a book with an awareness of what its pretensions actually are. This is not a cookbook. This is supposed to be a manual for organizing a political movement, to militate for social change, to galvanize dissent, however you want to put it, and considered as such a manual, considered from a pragmatic point of view. I think it's terrible. I think the book is a complete failure, and I say I've by no means even covered half of what I think is wrong about this book from that pragmatic perspective. I think also, for one thing, it's hard to give advice to people who don't want to hear it, and he comments on that too, actually, in the relatively early pages of the book, the great difficulty of giving unwanted advice. I think it's very difficult to be alive at any point in the history of the world and to recognize what are the factors that shape my own life, that shape my own perspective, that bias my outlook. What are the factors that are really unique to this decade or this year or this milieu? And what are the factors that I can actually generalize about and can talk to others about? I am intensely aware of that. I am intensely aware that my experience in Cambodia is not applicable to my experience in Canada. Truth be told, my experience in Cambodia politically is not applicable to my experience in Laos. Those are two countries right next door. My experience in Taiwan is not applicable to Hong Kong. Hong Kong is not applicable to China. I may be at the opposite extreme. And I'm really aware that even though I've been using them as examples here, there is definitely a sense in which, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. So you can ask the question, could a similar organization be successful in Russia right now? Maybe not. Maybe you have to look at the factors that made Mothers Against Drunk Driving a success, and maybe they can't be transferred between those two cultures. I don't know if the factors that made gay rights, the factors that made the gay rights movement so successful in Canada, could those be transferred to Russia? I don't mean in the past, I mean right now, Russia in 2016. Maybe not. I do think in a country like Russia, the struggle for gay rights is still very much uphill, whereas in Canada it's achieved its aims. In veganism and animal rights, we can't look back on a whole lot of success. There's very, very little. But if you want to talk about a success, the reforms that were passed by Ronald Reagan, the Ronald Reagan government of the United States, the reforms basically still today, the fundamental legislature on animal rights that changed how vivisection is done, exploitation of animals is done, and that was linked to the founding of PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. I don't know if we can draw lessons from that experience that will really give us guidance that's useful now in 2016. Probably not. The world has changed a lot in just a few decades. I do think there's a lot of deep and worthwhile musing to be done on how the assumptions of left-wing radicalism are inapplicable to so many of the social causes we may be pursuing today. By the way, I guess it's an irony. I have on my desk here, this is Karl Marx, Das Kapital, in Chinese translation. I'm not a Marxist, I'm the opposite. But for me, I'm learning the Chinese language, and this is the vocabulary I need to learn in terms of talking about economics and politics and what have you. I think I'm a very rare example of someone who is not left-wing, but is extremely well-educated and extremely well-versed in left-wing politics. And for me, I mean, most of the lessons I draw from that are cautionary. They're negative. It's saying, look, we need to be aware. I mean, if there are two things that can powerfully warp your perception of the world, they're success and their failure. Of the two, you can probably learn more from examining a failure. Okay, so I mean, in some ways, you can look back on the black struggle for civil rights, which is definitely the major inspiration in this book, and you can see the success African Americans have had. Okay, in the unique circumstances of the 1960s, United States of America. What lessons can you really draw from the success of African Americans in that situation that are applicable to any political question in 2016? What lessons can we draw from this that would be applicable to the struggle to raise the minimum wage in the United States of America? What lessons can we draw from it that are applicable to ecology, power generation? Any of these examples I've already mentioned in passing. The honest answer is damn few. There are very few positive lessons we can draw from that. But I think actually the number of negative lessons we can draw are enormous. The ways in which this book is inapplicable to, the guidance is impracticable, cannot be used in the pursuit of these other goals, that's a really long list of lessons we can learn. Definitely, it is just not the case. I mean, I think this book would lull some people into believing that all they need to do, and including, again, I have no idea the finance, who would pay you to do it, that all you need to do is walk into a community and harness their latent discontent, that they're seething with revolutionary fervor. Pardon me. They are seething with revolutionary fervor if only someone like Saul Alinsky walks in and educates them and harnesses that, and that this is not only a force for reform, but is a force for revolution that's out there in society. It's just not true. Least of all is it true in reference to something like ecology, animal rights, and veganism. I guess I'll close with that comment. You could simply you could make two categories, and categorize, on the one hand, there are causes, there are political movements that are harnessing already existing radicalism, already existing discontent with the establishment. And there are causes that are addressed to a public that is fundamentally comfortable, indifferent, not even interested in the question you're raising. I mean, how are you going to improve the conditions of chickens on factory farms? It's just not the case that people in the streets of Chicago are ready to rise up if you go into their ghettos and explain to them, do you know how terrible the lives of chickens are? Maybe they'll be interested. Maybe they'll listen to you. I mean, maybe you can have a conversation about it. But it's just ludicrous to imagine that this ultimately communist fantasy based on 1789, 1871, based on a very biased and selective reading of a few revolutions in the world's history. And, in Saul's case, based on his real life experience, too, in organizing discontented people. Maybe we have to talk about, on the one hand, the politics of contentment and the politics of discontent. But, acknowledging that, for me, that's only the start of a long list of reasons why I feel that the guidance provided by this book is not applicable to and is not useful in our political milieu today.